Welcome back to the Sense of Security podcast. I'm Cassidy Clement, Senior Manager of SEO and Content here at Interactive Brokers. And today I'm your host for the podcast. Our guest is Adam Brickner, IBKR's Compliance Officer for Special Products and Back Office. If you work in the financial business, or maybe you've done research on advisors, you'll come across different labels and securities licenses. We're going to discuss the general questions that you may have when you embark on this journey. Welcome to the program, Adam.
Thank you very much for having me.
Sure. So, most of our guests that are IB writers or other parts of the firm, they are repeat guests. But this is your first. This is your first kick at it. So, why don't you let the audience know a little bit about your industry background?
Sure. So I started in the business right out of college, in the 80s. I hate to go that far back. I basically I started on the trading desk. My first foray was in the world of trading. So I'm an ex-trader. I traded for up until about maybe 15 years ago. I made the switch over to the regulatory side of the business. Compliance was basically in its infancy back then. I mean, firms as big as Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley maybe had two or three compliance officers that really handled everything. Obviously, anybody that knows anything about the business, I mean, those numbers have, just expanded exponentially. Now, compliance is a big part of anything within the financial industry. And, again, I've been in compliance probably over 15 years at least. And that was the start of my foray into the business.
Well, today, what we're going to talk about, I think, is a really common piece for people getting into the financial sector or people who have already been in the financial sector and are looking to maybe expand their career or the exposure of what they work with. But for the most part, anybody in financial services or banking, et cetera, they hear about compliance all the time and they hear about these licenses and the numbers and the letters associated. But if we were going to explain this to more of the intro listeners or the beginner listeners, where can somebody actually obtain a securities license? Is that just through FINRA or are there other ways or designations?
Pretty much everything is really through FINRA. The one, I guess, really good thing that happened in, I think it was 2018 roughly, was this new thing called the SIE. So before, anybody who wanted to get licensed needed to be sponsored. Now you can go for this SIE and, obtain that before you're even sponsored by a firm. So, I know just from experience, people were working, going through college, straight out of college before they're actually employed can get this license to start the process going.
Yeah, the SIE actually came into play after I had already gotten my Series 7, but I think it's a good reference. So, for people listening who aren't totally sure, it's a little bit more of a foundational exam
Right.
for those entering this space who don't have a business background or maybe they have less exposure. It gives you a lot of the business 101, the accounting, general finance, general marketing ideas that are definitely crucial for understanding any additional details that you get into in the supporting or specialized licenses. That kind of leads me into the next piece, which is you were talking a little bit about sponsorship, but outside of that scope, the other major supporting piece is how you study, how you get access to this material.
Right.
Of course, internet has allowed for people to get access to things like never before. It's information age. But where do people actually get access to this material? I know educational companies exist,
Right.
but outside of the scope of Googling, how do I study for the Series 7? How do people get access to this material to study and prep?
Yeah, by far the easiest way is right through your company. Places like Interactive Brokers, whatever firm you're associated with, they usually have a subscription to one of these firms. So they will provide study material. Certain places also have proctors or classes or groups or online. Obviously, to your point, a lot of this stuff is done online. But the way this industry is and the way it is it's so dynamic, it is changing all the time that the easiest way to do it is really to go through one of these companies where you'll get the latest information, the most up to date rules. Going on the internet, you can absolutely find a lot of this stuff, but you don't know what's outdated. You don't know what rules have changed from the ones you're finding and seeing. So that is by far the easiest way to do it.
So once uh, I guess you could say you've solidified how you're going to study, the secondary piece is always costs associated because the materials themselves cost money. So does any prep, whether it's in person or if you maybe purchase a flashcard set online or something like that. But when it comes to the actual process of gaining the license, are there additional costs throughout the process? And then I guess is there additional costs after the fact for license retention?
For the most part, first of all, the firm usually absorbs all of those costs. So in other words, a firm like IB, for example, they may have a point where if you're taking the Series 7, they'll only allow 3 strikes and you're out. So they'll pay for, for 2 of those tests. The third one will be the determining factor where whether you pass or fail, it's on you. Some firms will make you pay for it, but it is definitely not a cheap process. The study material itself is expensive. Taking each test itself is expensive, and usually once you do pass, there are, online follow-up classes. I believe it's every year now, maybe every other year. I know it used to be 3 years, and yeah, it keeps getting shorter, and obviously, they want you to, stay refreshed with your knowledge. But so, once you obtain your license, there really isn't any cost afterwards. But the cost of obtaining your license can be significant depending upon how much information you need. If you're a finance student like I was, hopefully a lot of this stuff is ingrained into you and you have familiarity with a lot of it. There are plenty of people, as you were saying, that come from different industries and want to get it or become interested in finance, want to get into that, and they don't really have that background. They don't have that knowledge. They may need these proctors or again, these online things where again, it just keeps adding to the cost, but they definitely are not cheap. And usually, depending on the firm will absorb those costs. That's always been my experience.
Yeah, I mean, in my research as I was going through, I mean, it's been maybe 6 or 7 years at this point since I've taken an exam for the licenses, but the membership fees, registration fees, sometimes fingerprinting if you haven't already done that, any qualification exams, and then there's renewal fees. There's so many additional compounding costs that, if you're going to try to get into that area and retain a license, there's definitely things that you need to keep tabs on to make sure that you're not incurring extra unnecessary costs. But the most important thing I think is making sure that if you are going to go down a certain road for one of these licenses, understanding that some of them are for certain roles or maybe for certain topics. They're not all as broad as we'll say, like the SIE is, or maybe Series 7. So, would you be able to explain to the listeners some of the common licenses and what they're aligned with, or who they're aligned with, or the general idea they're aligned for?
I guess the best way to kind of look at it is like a triangle. As you said, you start at the base. It's much broader as you start going through. Everything gets more specific. Once you start getting into the advanced testing, it is absolutely, specific to whatever area you're covering. So usually you start off with the SIE. You'll go up to something like a Series 55 or a Series 7 if you're a trader. If you're just going to be and you're only going to be in compliance, you'll go over to areas like a Series 14, which is just a compliance officer exam. A Series 7 may be required in your role. It all depends on what you're doing. If you're talking to customers, if you're overseeing traders who are, taking on trading positions, it all depends on what you're overseeing. But then once you get these general registrations, then you become the specialized. So then if you go to say a Series 24, which then you become a principal, that's kind of the goal that a lot of companies like to see. There's a lot of, activity that you do as a compliance individual that require a Series 24, meaning that you have an extended, oversee level. And for a regulatory perspective, that's what they want to see. They're applicable to certain roles. And obviously, if you want to get ahead and you want to further your career, that's something you want. And then, depending upon what area is interested, you could go to something like a Series 4, which is an options principal exam. Series 52 goes into municipal trading. So depending upon what you want to do, what areas interest you, then you could look at and decide on, what registrations you want to take.
Something else that I didn't mention is that the time limit, the questions, the passing grade, and the cost all varies in addition to what each of these exams is for. So that's another piece that listeners who are looking to get into the area should really think about when they're starting to map out their journey. A lot of these places will give you uh, generalized study calendars, if you will, that give you an idea of if you need to learn the material in 6 weeks or 6 months, etc. It'll give you a general roadmap, but you really have to understand what the goal is in terms of what beast you're going to slay here. If it's going to be a 50 question test and you need a 70% to pass, you have a little bit of a barometer of how well or how quickly you yourself can retain the information and you can apply that to what you need to pass. But part of the, I think, big daunting piece is when you start to get into things like the Series 7, which is now the SIE, and then into the 7. Sometimes people don't always understand the time commitment, the material commitment, meaning retention of that material, and then also the cost, which we touched on a little bit. But from the perspective of just a generalization of any of these exams, what are some things that people should keep in mind when pursuing these licenses?
I think by far you're absolutely right. I guess the dedication that you need as a person is paramount. That's number one for any of these tests. Everybody is different. Again, took this right out of college. Again, went to finance. So a lot of this stuff was fresh in my mind. When I took the Series 7 straight out of college, I took it within months of my graduation. I didn't put in that much time. People said, no way would I pass it. And I did, not because, a brainiac or anything like that, but because I had that knowledge already. A lot of that stuff I had gone through my education. When I took my Series 4, which was, I don't know, probably about 10 years ago or so, I started going through the manual, going through the book. I read the first chapter, and I'll be blatantly honest with you, after I was done, I retained nothing. It was so involved and so in depth that it was hard to retain the information. So the best thing for me was the way I, learned the stuff was simply by doing the practice test. I went over the practice test over and over for me and for the way I learned. That's just what enabled me, best to kind of learn the information. So I think part of it is definitely about, knowing the individual. Everybody is different, but without a question, it's dedication. This isn't something you study for an hour or two and you go and take the test. This is something you study for weeks, if not months, and you get as prepared as you want because the last thing you want to do is have to go through it and take it again. It's worth all the time and the effort you can to learn everything, to take the practice tests, to go through it. And if you're borderline, you're not ready. You need to really, really be passing these tests as you go through and be confident that when you're sitting there on that computer taking the real exam that you're going to pass that first time. Because, regardless of how much time and effort you have to put in, it's worth it. Taking the test the second time, it's so much added time and effort on your part. So that I think that all comes into play. But yeah, these are not easy tests, any of them, and they just keep getting harder. They keep getting longer. They keep expanding the scope of these tests, and they keep expanding on the information that's contained within these exams.
I think the value of going into these exams after being in a college setting, or even if you're somebody who just took a course for a different certification, or you just took a class at a local college to learn about some specialization, having your attention and your work style already be in that focused state is very valuable because, as you said, there is a lot of information and a lot of complexities in these types of study materials. In all honesty, a lot of it is written because they are not sure if the people reading already have the background or not. And that's kind of how the SIE came to be. But it's if you come in with a business acumen already, there is a lot of brush that you can clear out that you maybe already understand. Whether it's, okay, I know what a balance sheet is, or I already understand the difference between a call and put option. There's a lot that you can then dive right into the focused and specific material. But if you are just kind of getting back into the swing of things, there's so much to absorb, and sometimes it's very hard to pick and choose what's worth it and what's not to spend your time, because you may end up reading a chapter that you are fully understanding of and you don't realize that until you hit the end. That can happen for sure. But I will say also, those practice exams and a lot of the supporting material, it's incredibly helpful, and it really gets you ready to be in that testing environment. I remember getting up and going to mine at 6 in the morning. There was no sunlight. It was in a place with no windows. You walk in, you show them your ID, and you lock your stuff up in a locker, and you are in there for hours
Yeah.
with nothing but a whiteboard and a computer. And you have to trust yourself that you can get through a lot of this information by digging really deep. And sometimes the questions are there to kind of trip you up. And that's just speaking for the basic licensures, not even the higher, more in depth ones can sometimes be a 4 hour long test. Who knows? That's a lot of material. Are there certain tests or any certifications that you went through that you have an anecdote or something like that for our listeners that made you go, oh, okay, I am so glad that I finished this and I don't have to take it again and that I dedicated my time the right way the first time.
Yeah, the Series 4, again, the options principle, that was definitely one of them. But just to touch on a couple of points that you said, because I think that they are kind of important. The one other big help that the tests, provide is that when you go through them, they kind of also tell you what areas are your strengths and what areas are your weaknesses. So when you go through those practice tests, you'll be able to kind of pinpoint and get a better idea of what areas you really need to focus on, and what areas again are your weaknesses that maybe you need to put extra time in studying, or maybe go back and read chapters again, or take additional tests in those areas. The anecdotes, yeah. So when you do go into that test, it's exactly as you stated. You go in there, you're assigned a locker, you put every single thing, piece of your belongings in there. You go in with empty pockets. For the options exam, the one thing that is and made it difficult for me. I was, a finance major, so math was always my strong point. But for options, they hand you a calculator and you go in there. And for me, that was the big issue. You have to do calculations related to, options expirations and all of this stuff. And, that you either know or you don't, and also to your point, you will see questions that say, which is the best answer? And the reality is sometimes two of those answers are right, but they're looking for that one that is more correct. And there are sometimes where they'll say, whatever, choice A, choice B, both choice A and B, neither, so it isn't as easy as just, yeah, just A, B, C, or D, and one of those answers is going to be right. It's never that straightforward. The test is hard enough as it is just to learn the material. But yeah, FINRA always has this extra twist where, they make sure you absolutely know this backwards and forwards completely.
Yeah, the calculations especially, there's nothing fancy usually about those calculators.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah,
usually the most basic ones,
that's it.
so you have to know the formulas inside and out, and, I could speak for a lot of people when I say when I was studying for that, I basically was eating, breathing, and sleeping Series 7 for
Yeah.
6 months because you had to know it inside and out. But you brought up some awesome points and really, good tips for our listeners.
And my pleasure, truthfully, my pleasure, reminiscing about the good old I'm very happy I do have a lot of these licenses. I'm happy that, I have a lot of the, I guess, more important ones where I don't have to go back and do that, but yeah, it was not a it was not a pleasurable experience going through it all, but in the end, well worth it, and these are all things that, future employees look for. They absolutely do. Things like a Series 24 where a principal where they know that you could be in a more senior management role, Series 4 for options, if that's your thing, where again, you could be in a senior role, overlooking an options desk, or, something to do with options. But depending upon what you want, yeah, they are definitely not easy to come by, but well worth it once you succeed.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely tough getting up to it, but worth the journey. Always can be helpful in career development and also finding out if you like another portion of the business. So, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Sure. So, as always, listeners can learn more about an array of financial topics for free at Interactive Brokers and IBKRcampus.com. Follow us on your favorite podcast network and feel free to leave us a rating or review. Thanks for listening, everyone.
The analysis in this material is provided for information only and is not and should not be construed as an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to buy any security. To the extent that this material discusses general market activity, industry, or sector trends, or other broad-based economic or political conditions, it should not be construed as research or investment advice. To the extent that it includes references to specific securities, commodities, currencies, or other instruments, those references do not constitute a recommendation by IBKR to buy, sell or hold such investments. This material does not and is not intended to take into account the particular financial conditions, investment objectives or requirements of individual customers. Before acting on this material, you should consider whether it is suitable for your particular circumstances and, as necessary, seek professional advice.